put ourselves in a prayerful mode for a few seconds. Can we do that? Bow our heads in prayer. Out of the silence we address you, great God, as the gracious mystery, beyond all words and images. We pray you send your Spirit upon all of us today. Open our minds and hearts to your word. And we pray, as always, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who continues to be with us now and forever. Amen. Good. Well, welcome everybody here. The general plan is for me to give a lot of presentation on the idea of community and certain virtues that I think are helpful for building up the body of Christ. And then lunch is at noon, and anyone who wants to, after lunch, wants a little tour of our new building here, we'll be glad to do that. On the table there'll be some booklets that have pictures and sort of explanation of the architecture and the art in here, which people are welcome to pick up and take. The genesis of this presentation is that I did something like this before, and I was talking about playing off of Steve Covey's book about, habits for successful people, 7 habits. And so I was working on 6 virtues for effective ministry. And last time I got through 4 of them, as I recall. And so learning from that experience, instead of trying to cover the 2 other ones, I'm covering only one of them. And that is the virtue I'm calling committed openness, and the virtue which I hope helps us in this community building process that's important to us. As always, I want to try to make this concrete, so I'll use a composite kind of example, and I'm going to build on that throughout the whole morning's presentation. I hope when we get near the end, the talk is structured around attempting to understand our situation and a lot of theological perspectives I want to share. And then there's a practical section which says, how do we build up community? And I'm hoping there that maybe we can share some of our ideas and learn from one another. So that's my general structure of the presentation. So let me deal with a couple. This is Fred and Doris, a composite story. And Fred and Doris are middle-aged people, and their marriage is not in great shape. I want to sort of give background how they got to this point. Doris grew up in a very Christian family. She went to church regularly. She loved going to church. The pastor knew her by name and would greet her. The family knew other people in the parish. Going to church on Sunday morning was a really social kind of experience. It made them feel rooted and helped them in many ways. Doris was involved in the youth group, and they made trips to various places, and she came close to, she had lifelong friends in that youth group that she was part of. When she went away to university to study, she got involved in a church group there, and again found that to be a very rewarding kind of experience. Came back to her hometown and met Fred, and they fell in love and got married. They had a beautiful church wedding in this parish where she had grown up, where she had been baptized, and it was a gorgeous experience. The pastor made the ceremony very personal because he knew the family and just wove in all the family history. It's a beautiful kind of occasion, and it meant a lot to Doris. They stayed in town for a while. They had their first baby baptized in that parish, and again, it was a very communal kind of experience for her, uplifting. And then Fred's job took them elsewhere, and they moved, And she went and she tried to find a church in the new town, and she went to a church that she would think would be part of her tradition, and it didn't feel right to her. It felt cold. She felt the pastor was sort of aloof. They didn't know people. They didn't feel like they fit in. They tried going there for a while, and then they sort of gradually dropped out. And they kept going on Christmas and so on, but it was not that same sort of vital involvement. Well, that created in Doris a lot of questions and longings, and she felt a need for getting connected in, and so she joined a woman's group. And the women's group got together once a week. They met for an hour and a half. And a lot of times they had included a meal with it. They do dinner or lunch together. And in this women's group, they talked a lot about their common problems, their difficulties at the work site. They were all women who had their own independent life or careers in a way. They talked a lot about the difficulties at work, and in many ways they didn't find it fulfilling. And the dog-eat-dog competitive world of the corporations and other organizations they worked for didn't feel right to them. And they did a lot of encouraging of one another. A number of them were going back to school. In fact, Doris decided to go back and start taking some courses, thinking about she might get a Well, again, reminder that we're going to go now till noon. And then there's lunch immediately afterwards. And then anybody who wants a tour of the church after lunch, I will do that. And there's booklets out there, 10-page booklets with wonderful pictures of the church in it, which everyone's welcome to take. I want to move to the Christology part, which is, I think, the central part of what we're about here. I'm borrowing here from Gerhard Lofink, Jesus and Community. Can I ask how many people have read that book? It's a very old book now. It's back in 1982. I read it a long time ago, but I went back over it. It's great stuff. Anyway, the essence of it has to do with seeing Jesus as a community builder, and obviously to our part here, very important. It just becomes interesting to read the New Testament in the light of that perspective of thinking of community and how Jesus related to communities and so on. What Lofink talks about is this great thrust of Jesus to reconstitute Israel, to reform Israel, to get Israel back to being the people of God and therefore the light to the nations. And this is where you get all the language about I've come to the lost sheep of Israel, I'm not ministering elsewhere, and so on. We'll get into that. So there's a number of ways of thinking about Jesus as the community builder. And the first is in thinking about the 12. It's very important to distinguish 12 from apostles. The word apostle is obviously larger. We got a woman apostle, Junia. We got Paul. We got a lot of apostles. But the 12 is a technical term in the New Testament for that original group of witnesses. And what Lofink brings out is the whole idea of the symbolic importance of the 12. So that he gives us this kind of picture, that Jesus has this mission to reconstitute Israel, to get Israel to be faithful to the covenant, and his ministry is to Israel. And that's not going well, in a sense. That's a tremendous problem. And so his strategy is to work with a symbolic group, where having the 12 becomes absolutely crucial, to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Not as a substitute for Israel, no, but as a representative grouping of the whole of the Israelite people, all 12 tribes. And of course, we get the remembrance of the great importance of the 12. It's not accidental or unimportant, it's absolutely crucial. As we see, when one defected, the response was not, hey, 11 of us will carry on. You know, we got all we need with us 11 here. They couldn't do that. They had to bring in another one, and they picked Matthias. And so to get back to the 12, to represent the 12 tribes of Israel in this great mission. So Jesus is about the business of gathering. There's a lot of sense that Jesus is influenced by Ezekiel. The language of Ezekiel is of a gathering language, of bringing people together. Everything I could ever want, and yet there's something missing for me. There's where we find Doris and Fred, and they're now searching for a church or trying to find something in their church that's going to help them. So my question, is, as pastoral ministers, what are we going to do for Fred and Doris? How do we help Fred and Doris? That's my touchstone throughout all of this. I want to understand the dynamics of what happened with them. Why did they get to where they are? And I want to, as well, try to look theologically at how we would work out some approaches to dealing with them. Now, in the notes you have some preliminary comments, introductory comments, and so on. The first thing that I would want to say is that helping Doris and Fred is really important. Helping all the Dorises and Freds of life to find something deeper, something more is worthwhile doing. It's worthwhile getting up on Monday morning to do it. It's worthwhile coming here today to figure out how to do it better. It's a lot better than selling soap. There's an intrinsic meaning in trying to help Fred and Doris make something more out of their lives, to find deeper meaning, to find, in this case, some sense of community. That's worthwhile. When it's time to check out, if we could say we helped Doris and Fred, that'd be a good thing. It'd be worthwhile when we check out to say, I helped some people like that. I freed some people, helped them to find some connections in life. So I think this is important. In trying to figure out how to help them, I'm trying to draw on the social sciences today, especially represented by Robert Bella, who some people know, Habits of the Heart, and Robert Wuthnow, a Princeton sociologist, who I find very helpful in my own work. I'm going to draw on them. And then my own conviction that the theologians have something to tell us. You see the 6 figures on the walls at the baptismal font. People saw those. I'm going to have a quiz later in the morning as to who can name them. The one in the far back on my left is an obscure German theologian, Jesuit by the name of Karl Rahner. And Rahner is a great influence on my own thinking, and I was privileged to meet with Rahner, spend time with him. He wrote an introduction to a book I wrote about him, and so on. So you get a lot of Rahnerian thought whenever I'm talking. That's Uncle Carl back there on the wall. I think he's in an Episcopal church in San Francisco, isn't he? Also a stained glass window where he is. I don't know many other churches that have a likeness of Rahner, but there he is, pretty stern-looking German Jesuit back there, with a heart of gold. And Rahner, he loved people. He loved to help people, simple ways. He was a community builder in his own way. First thing he told me when I met him is, don't become a disciple of mine. Don't be a disciple. We have a larger community to attend to. Go back and do in your own setting what I tried to do in my own German academic setting. Very good advice, I thought. But Rahner said that the more scientific theology is, the more practical it is. The better theology is done, the more pastorally relevant it will be. The more that we know the tradition and the Scriptures, the more we're immersed in that tradition, and the more we know the questions of the day, the more what we are about will be spiritually helpful to people like Doris and Fred. If we're going to help Doris and Fred, it helps to know some theology, I believe. It's not simply a matter of some techniques that one could use. There's a deeper thing going on. So that's part of my major conviction, is that theology is helpful in all of that. And my sense is that we ministers pastoral ministers need virtues to help us, and I'm going to concentrate on one called committed openness today as a virtue that would help us serve Doris and Fred, I think. Community, that's an interesting word. And I think it's got a positive ring. We're not afraid to say that. We can talk about the gay community or the Afro-American community. We're not afraid of the word. In fact, we use it because we think it resonates positively with people. And I'm not going to do a full-blown history of that word or explanation of it. I'm drawing on Max Shaler and others here to say that the community stands somewhere between primary grouping like a family, where you don't have any choice about it. You know, here you are, well, you got choice for the husband and wife to marry, but then you got kids and they're like this and who knows why and so on. You know, that's primary grouping. And on the other hand, it's like where Fred works, a corporation. You know, so the community is somewhere in between there. Community has to do with having a common orientation. So in the Christian world, our common orientation is to sort of take seriously Christ, be committed to the gospel. You know, and we have common goals like spreading the kingdom, and common values like love and compassion and forgiveness. So in communities, we expect there to be face-to-face interaction. We expect to know one another by name. We expect it to be something like it was for Doris when she was growing up. Known by name, recognized by face, personally interactive with others in the community. That's part of what we mean by this word community. So that is sort of a descriptive kind of sense of that. Let me read something of the kind of ideal. This is something I wrote for the Catholic bishops a number of years ago, one of their pastoral letters that I wrote for them, and I tried to describe an ideal community of faith, to say what I'm thinking about here. I wrote this, in the ideal community of faith, the mystery that rules over our lives is named and worshipped. Dedication to Christ is fostered, and openness to all truth, goodness, and beauty is maintained. The ideal community. The life of the Spirit is nourished and discussed. You notice the Trinitarian framework there? Life of the Spirit is nourished and discussed. Positive images of God and Christ and the afterlife warm the heart and structure the imagination. An emotional component and an imaginative component in this. The common good is emphasized and personal development encouraged. Tension, synthesis between common good and personal development. That's a crucial component of any real understanding of community, I think. Common good is emphasized, but personal development is encouraged. Individuals experience true freedom and at the same time accept responsibility for the well-being of the whole community, the group. Again, both of those things. You can see the dialectical sense I have about all of this. Traditional wisdom is available, and the best contemporary insights are valued. Tradition and development are important. Prayerful liturgies enable us to praise God with full hearts and create a sense of belonging, as well as nourish people for a life of service. Again, dialectical tension. Worship gives us this deeper sense of the mystery, but it propels us outwards to do something in a life of service. Members are known by name and newcomers are welcomed. Unity of faith is celebrated while legitimate pluralism is recognized. Unity, pluralism, both things, again, feel the dialectic of all of this. Individuals find both support and challenge. You'll see later on it's one of the great problems with the way we're trying to do things today. Both support and challenge. Word challenge is important, and can share their joys and their sorrows. Place where you can cry and laugh. The members hunger for justice and have the courage to fight the dehumanizing tendencies in the culture. The community knows the sorrows of life but remains a people of hope. In this ideal community of faith, the members are of one heart and mind, Acts 4:32, and receive the spirit of wisdom which brings them to full knowledge of Jesus Christ, who is the head of the church. Well, that was an effort to say something of what I mean by community as I'm talking about. A Christian community would have that feel to it, that sort of dialectical sense of keeping things in fruitful tension. Now, to try to analyze the situation that Doris and Fred find themselves in, I'm dividing this up into two ways. One are positive signs of the times, one negative. So I want to start with the negative signs of the times. So it's common we talk about reading the signs of the times. That's our theological language for doing our sociological analysis, finding out what's going on, what's happening. And here the world of social science is important to us. So I suggest I'm drawing on Robert Bellah here first of all. Bellah, a lot of people know Bellah's Habits of the Heart. Bellah tells us that we got a great problem of individualism in our country. And he describes two kinds of individualism. The first one is Fred. He calls it a utilitarian individualism. And it means that it's a product of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, remember, had no use for religion. It thought, the European Enlightenment thought religion got in the way. Remember Voltaire, smash the infamous thing. The infamous thing, of course, was the church. Smash the infamous thing. Why? Just to be destructive? No, because the infamous thing blocks human development, keeps us from having genuine human community. That authoritarian structure blocks equality and democracy and all the things that the Enlightenment would stand for. In the United States, that gets translated in another word. Jefferson had a much more positive sense of the Enlightenment and the role of religion. Got to always remember that the American Enlightenment did not have the anti-clericalism and the anti-church that the European Enlightenment. Jefferson was not walking around saying, smash the infamous thing. He was saying the church can help us. Religion can help us to create the kind of society that we want. So the American Enlightenment had a very different feel to it. And in the United States, this whole individualism, which Bellah calls a utilitarian individualism, ended up producing a model of the good life. The real model of full humanity is sort of a rational, cool, good decision maker. You know how to get things done. You know what the goal is. You can find the means and make it happen. It is the managerial type that we celebrate and pay a lot of money. If you want to know what our culture values, just look around at where all the money is. I can tell you in raising money for this church, the money is in the corporate world. And it's those managers who figure out how to get things done that we pay a lot of money to. Not to professors at campuses or teachers or whatever, not to social workers, nobody like that. People who make the money are the people who can get it done. It's a triumph of utilitarian individualism. That's Fred. That's Fred's the model of the manager who is efficient and goal-oriented and also ends up at the age of 47 saying, what's it all about now that I am vice president for whatever. Now, Bellah says another kind of individual is a reaction, and that's Doris. This is an expressive kind of individualism, but it's still individualism. That is, she doesn't like her husband, she doesn't like the corporate world, nor do the rest of the people in her woman's group. That's a dog-eat-dog world. Her husband's gone too much, takes too many hours, he wasn't there to help her raise the kids. That's where utilitarian individualism takes you. You climb the corporate ladder and miss life. And so Doris's reaction is, I'm not going to miss life. I'm going to develop my talent. I'm going to go back to school. We're going to buck the glass ceiling. We're going to move up. And we're going to, in terms not of financially, but of self-actualization. I'm going to learn to marshal my feelings. I'm going to have self-fulfillment. I'm going to have self-liberation from all the constraints around me that said women should only get paid 3/4 of what men get or whatever. That's what Bellah means by an expressive individualism. And he sees that as having the same kind of problem as the utilitarian individualism. It doesn't get us anywhere. It plays into the problem as we've seen it. Now, all of that individualism has made it hard for us to deal with institutions. I turn here to Wuthnow. Wuthnow has a book out called Loose Connections. And he says what happens in the modern world is that when individuals played off against institutions, then they are seen as the adversary. Institutions get in our way from doing what we want to do. They're a drag, and we don't trust them, and we're afraid to commit ourselves to them. And so we get this sort of hanging loose from that. And he talks about the porous character of the institutions in which we live. They don't hold, so family life doesn't hold. These remarkable statistics we've seen lately. Only about 1/4 of kids now grow up in a family where you got two parents together. It's no longer the norm. It's not even close to that. So we've got the family doesn't hold. What we got since 1960, 1 out of every 4 marriages broke up in 1960, and now marriages break up at the rate of 1 out of every 2, half of them. So that's what he means by porous institutions. They don't hold us anymore. They don't hold our loyalty. Jobs the same way. People change jobs, change careers many times in a lifetime. And then Bella plays it out in The Good Society also. Then Bella wrote this article in America Magazine. It's cited in your notes. I've been very taken with that article. But fundamentally what he says is that the problem's even deeper than we might have thought. And that is that we have a flawed cultural code. Flawed cultural code that at the very bottom of what we're all about. This individualism is so rooted that we no longer have a language for the common good. We no longer have a way of thinking about getting out of our own narrow existence and thinking bigger and in more universal terms. A flawed moral code, which he thinks is operative and deep in our souls. And worse than that, he says religion plays into the problem. The religion as we've known it in the United States has been too individualistic itself. Now, he's a very hard, as you know, grew up as a Presbyterian and as a practicing Episcopalian. And so I guess he can, speak about out of the Protestant world. He's very harsh on the Protestant world, but I'd like to include us Catholics in his critique, which he doesn't, because we got our own sort of private notion of piety. I'm going to get my soul to heaven. Bella doesn't recognize that about us Catholics. We got our own private problem. That is, I'm going to save my soul. I'm not worried about the Tonga people in Africa. I'm going to save my soul. And a lot of Catholic piety still revolves around that. But Bella says that the problem in the United States is that religion's feeding into the difficulty. It's helping to create the individualism by talking about private piety, me and Jesus. And Jesus saving me, I'm getting my soul to heaven, whatever the language is in our various traditions. So there's a very sharp critique by Bella of the individualism, which then is messing us up because then we can't work together, can't collaborate, can't dialogue, don't get things done, and the society is in big trouble as a result. Might also bring the technology in here. We got that interesting image, the electronic moat. Some woman was telling the high school teacher that his son is having trouble. He says, well, I don't know. He says he comes home from school and he goes, locks himself in his room, and he's on the computer all the time. I don't know what he's doing. Well, there's a lot of bad things he could be doing. But one of the inherent problems, and we fear this at the university, for example, the electronic moat, where people get into the computer, becomes obsessive, and face-to-face relationships break down. Community breaks down. I realize there's an ambivalence as technology brings people together. I remember a woman I was doing spiritual direction with from Ann Arbor, and she was into women's issues, and I kept telling her that there are kindred souls out there. She says, I can't find them at the University of Michigan. I said, there's people on a spiritual search just like you are. I'm telling you to find them. She went to the internet. She created a whole internet community. of people have felt just like she did about a deep spiritual search and crucial character of women's issues. And then I remember her telling me that after all these people were emailing back and forth and so on, they decided to come together for a weekend someplace. So obviously electronic means can pull people together, but it also does have this danger of isolation and this electronic moat effect that keeps us from interacting with others. Out of all of this, we end up with Doris hungering for community. Doris has got her little group of 11 women to get together, but she feels there's some further need she has. And we'll name that a hunger for church community, hunger for a faith community, hunger for a parish that will stimulate and nourish and challenge and support her, be all those things that I was trying to talk about. The second negative sign of the times is the problem of polarization. Probably got no better way to look at that than to raise the abortion issue. Where the interesting things about the abortion issue is there's almost no dialogue about it. And I read it this way. People have their views, and we know what the other person's views are, and we don't talk to the ones who are different. I have had, over the last 20 years, very few serious conversations with people on the other side of the abortion issue. Very few. Now, maybe other people's experiences is different. I mean, a real engaged, civil discussion, debate, whatever. Very few out of this major social issue. I mean, that's, to me, astounding. I read it as this, that people are just cautious. People aren't ready for that kind of discussion. We're polarized on the question. So by polarization, I mean where differences now get hardened. And you can't talk to one another about it. There's no room for dialogue, no room then for collaborative efforts. A lot of polarization in the society and in the church. People know the name of Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago, who died and taught a lot of us to befriend death in the process. I worked with Cardinal Bernardine for 4 years on what we call the Common Ground Project. Got to know him, and great experience, one of the great experiences of my life. And Bernardine was convinced that within the churches, the polarization is this great problem. That we got in congregations, we got groups that don't talk to one another, groups that can't get along, and that we had to overcome that. Of course, he was concerned about it in our Catholic community, but I'm sure it's across the board. We can't be alone on this polarization issue. He was convinced that this was a terrible problem, and he made it the last driving effort of his life to try to figure out how to find common ground, how to be able to dialogue with people who were very different from us. And where we worked out, we produced a document called Called to be Catholic, which gave a lot of rules for dialogue. But the polarization problem is real in society and in the church. And finally, there's the problem of the patterns of domination. I hold out, two obvious ones: patriarchy, the glass ceiling, women's issues, patterns of domination where women are dominated by men, have trouble achieving partnership. Our students taught a partnership. I remember doing marriage counseling with one couple, and the young woman there is preparation for marriage. She's talking about 50-50 on domestic chores and so on, and partnership, and there's all the language. And she says to me in the middle of it, she says, "I know I'm not getting 50-50 on this." She says, I figure I'm lucky at 75-25. And the guy looks at me and he says, "You think she'll settle for 12.5?" I mean, our young people talk partnership today, but there is so many cultural problems around it, and stereotypical behaviors from parental generation and so on, that true partnership in marriage really still is a difficult task in our culture. And when people achieve it, it's wonderful to see and a great blessing for all of us. And the other one, of course, is racism. and so difficult lingering social problem. I was just at a conference on television. We were trying to talk about finding creative uses of television to get the Christian message across. And there was a black man there, and we got in conversation over dinner. And he just went through, I mean, it's familiar, but still so touching about the simple thing of driving a car. He's a wealthy man, and he drives a big car, and he does that in major cities, and he will invariably get stopped. And he talked about sometimes, well, I mean, really rough treatment. Just, one signal of the racism that still exists. He can't drive his car in a city without getting stopped. And it's repeated for nothing, I mean, and often very uncivil treatment when it happens. One time he was on his way to see the governor of New Jersey when he was stopped. And they demanded, where are you going? I'm going to see the governor. Anyway, lingering kinds of patterns of domination. So that's my sort of negative reading of the signs. Let me just stop here and see if anybody wants to ask something about this or comment on it up till this point. Yeah.
Sports and celebrity. Isn't that kind of a negative sign of the times? I mean, the Yankee shortstop getting paid $105 million.
No. 17 mil a year, isn't it? No. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, one of the things that we see, is the inequities, the continuing underclass, permanent underclass, enduring underclass, disparity, if you look at that sort of salaries and the salaries of corporate executives and vis-a-vis the ordinary working people. No other countries like that. And it creates difficulties. Well, it creates difficulties for us in the church world, since our congregations often have a mixture of people from socioeconomic classes. It's a strange phenomenon for sure. Yeah, I could easily put it into the mix, I'm sure. Yeah.
One of the main polarizations which I've come across within Christianity is their insistence that they have the only worldview.
Yeah.
That they refuse to admit that all people of the world are God's children.
No. The point is made that a major source of division, polarization, is Christian exclusivism. My translations, Christian exclusivism, where Christians believe that they are the only ones to be saved, or believe that everyone else is in the darkness and they're in the light. No appreciation of the world religions and as vehicles of truth and salvation. In our Catholic framework, I love to come back to our Catholic people in Lumen Gentium, one of the main documents in Vatican II. It says, God does not deny His grace of salvation even to those who have not yet learned to call Him by name, as long as they follow their conscience. So I love to come up to our Catholic exclusivists and point out texts like that in Second Vatican Council, which are supposed to be running our own outlook, and to make it clear that there's another way of thinking about all of this. In Vatican II documents, you got wonderful statements about the other world religions as being vehicles of truth and grace, and seeing positive things in them. So we have to find our ways, but you're right. Major polarization around that. Let me take a more positive view of this thing, more positive signs of the times. Going back to de Tocqueville, when the most insightful observer of the American scene there's ever been, he's still drawn to Tocqueville's understanding of our culture, his great work, Democracy in America. And just to pick out one of the things that he saw about us, he said the genius of those Americans is their voluntary associations, the way they come together to get things done, the way a group will come together to build a library or to improve schools or to run a blood drive or whatever. And I think that Tocqueville's insight remains true. our sense of voluntary organization on a limited basis to get things done continues to our own time. Michael Novak, the American Enterprise Institute, loves to play this up, loves to look at the world of sports as a way in which we learn teamwork. I think one of the great positive signs of our times is the growth of women's athletics. I think that is tremendous in terms of this whole community idea, so that women are not standing around cheering for men, but have their own thing to do, and not only their own individual sports, they play golf and stuff like that, but their team sports. And the wonderful things we saw with the soccer team and all of that is a way in which we Americans have traditionally learned how you get along, how you have teamwork. That's why John Rocker's situation is so jarring to people, because in the world of sports, very often the athletes did get along, or not totally so, but they played together and they worked together on a common task, and whites and Hispanics and blacks and so on, and have a team effort. Willie Stargell said for the Pittsburgh Pirates back when they won the World Series, "We are a family. We are a family." So that there, and I think that women with their greater opportunities in the sports world now have a chance to learn more about teamwork in a competitive setting and so on, which I think is to our advantage one way or another. So there is a way in which we've worked together. I mean, look at how on an ordinary level of people working on jobs, Protestants and Catholics got along for a long time without any official ecumenical movement or something. I mean, it just worked side by side in many places without any great difficulties. So there is that teamwork sort of sense of things that happen. One of the things that grows out of this associational principle remains important to us pastorally. Fred is up to here with involvement. Fred is not hungering for community. He wants to get away from people. You've got to be nice to people all day long at work. You're not hungering for community. Make a big mistake if we think everybody around the United States is hungering for community. A lot of people are in various groupings that require part of their time and energy, and they don't care. I mean, they want to get away from it. Associational principle says you try to get people involved on a very limited basis. That's why associations work, because people don't give their life away to it. Maybe for a while they'll work on the PTA for 3 years and then they're out of there. And they'll coach the Little League team while their kids are going through that phase, and then they'll go do something else. So that limited commitment that we Americans are used to can be played to advantage. I'm seeing this as a positive sign of the times. And then there's this whole remarkable small group movement. Wuthnow is the great student of this. He's got a book called Sharing the Journey. I got all these book titles in the notes. Wuthnow, Sharing the Journey, very helpful book. But he says that over a 5-year period you track Americans, and over half of us in a 5-year period are involved in some serious small group activity. And the typical norm was to meet once a week, like Doris meets with her women friends, once a week for an hour, hour and a half, where there's a real commitment to get there to the group. Now, there's problems with it, because if Doris ends up not liking these other 5 women in the group and they're getting on her nerves, Doris says, "Bye, I don't need this." So the small group thing is terrific. I mean, there's millions of people involved in these small groups, and they're significant, and they commit themselves to them. And Doris is going to get there Tuesday lunch, no matter what. I mean, she makes a big effort to get there. She's committed to the group. She likes those people, face-to-face relationships. But Doris is always ready to walk. She can go do something else sometime. So there's a very loose connection. And I think that what Wuthnow tells us is that there's a great danger of what we might call group narcissism. That's one of the major problems of the small group movement. They are supportive, but not challenging to see the bigger picture. So people want to be with kindred spirits, right? The divorced want to be together. And the great danger is the divorce keep talking to one another all the time. Before long, they're all victims. They all had this terrible thing, and now we just have sort of a group victimhood. And the group doesn't get outside of itself. Always a danger. So we got great support. We even call them support groups. Maybe we need more challenge groups. Where the real dominant thrust is something else, like to stop being a victim, or think about the racial problem and don't just hold hands and pray together. Do something outward to make the world better. Something like that. So the small group is an ambivalent thing, but I think it is a positive thing for sure for pastoral ministers to take this penchant for joining small groups as part of what we got to be about. There's a willingness to get involved in small groups, a need for it. Our job is to channel that sort of energy, it seems to me, in one way or another. I think it's interesting that a lot of these groups have become the spiritual base for people. Like Doris right now, that's her spirituality, that woman's group. For many people, obviously we know people in AA, many people say their involvement in AA is where their spirituality is. We go to church and fine, I don't get much out of it. But boy, in that AA group, there's honest sharing. There, you can't get away with anything. There, people challenge you and so on. So maybe that's where part of that challenge is. So that becomes a source of spirituality, and surely we pastoral ministers need to learn from all of this. Then, signs of the times, maybe this is a stretch, and there's all kind of ambivalence about this, but I try to think through the way institutions do work. It's remarkable. No one's talking about a military coup in this year in the United States. We're talking about elections. We don't expect the president to get the army to keep him in office for another 4 years. I mean, that's unremarkable to us, but look at the rest of the world. An awful lot of troubles along that line, and it just goes on for us. In other words, it works. I like to not to be totally negative on the multinational corporations. I mean, they got a stake in keeping peace. Could be that the multinationals become great peacemakers. They don't want any wars. They want security. That's how they function, where life goes better for them. So you can make a lot of criticisms of them, but they do have a penchant for wanting to preserve the peace. Our economy has helped many people to make it. Contrast our educational, graduate education with Japan. Talk about, all the great stuff, the Japanese great education system, their kids study when they're in grade school years, high school times, and so on. But there's a lot of criticism of their graduate education as not unleashing creativity. It seems that a lot of people want to come and study here who want to really make a contribution. So maybe we do some things right that way. A lot of Americans belong to religious institutions, an unbelievable number, really. It's about 2/3. And some of our parishes are terrific. We really have to say that some of our congregations really do well. They're tremendous communities, just like Doris grew up in. There's a lot of churches like Doris grew up in. They're good. Worship is meaningful. Homilies give stimulation. They help prepare people for marriages. They work. Small groupings, people know one another. Rural parishes that work well. Some of our urban parishes, great jobs in the inner city. We need to celebrate that as one of the positive signs of the times. What I'd like to do now is invite a few minutes of one-to-one discussion. I'd like you to turn to a person next to you and just say, like, what made sense out of all that for me? What out of all that analysis, what would help me pastorally, or what should I keep in mind in my own thing? You could find a different partner instead of talking to your associate or spouse if you want. Feel free. That's too threatening. Just going to do this a couple minutes. Think of something positive of what I said, something that would help you. There you go. Slight movement. Tom? Are you open to talk to Tom Landgraf there?
Hi, I'm sorry.
All right, could I have your attention, please? Just to structure our time for people, around 10:30 I'm looking for a break so we can last till then. Then we'd take a break and then do another segment up till noon when we would eat. Anybody want to make comment or question on that segment, what I was calling the reading of the signs of the times, both positive and negative. Yeah?
Do you have copies of your description of the ideal faith community, or are they in one of the books that you
It's taken out of a document called Empowered by the Spirit, and as a matter of fact, I do have copies. Thank you. We very easily make this available to anybody who would want it. It's one segment out of a longer document. It's called Empowered by the Spirit's Pastoral Letter for Campus Ministers. I worked on that for 5 years and went around the country and visited a lot of campus ministry programs and so on. And I mean, the rest of the document could be of interest too. There's a whole segment to put it in some context. That document says that for campus ministers, there's really these 6 different ministerial functions that we are about, and one of them is forming community. It's from that segment, and forming community is seen as sort of the central part of then doing the other things like working for justice and facilitating personal development and training leaders and forming the Christian conscience and appropriating the faith, trying to understand the faith. But community is seen as the central core of that. Without the community, we can't do those other things. So that's what that's from, yeah. Yeah, we can easily make that. We will make it available. No?
We hear more the term culture war being used. Is that a form of a clash between the two kinds of individualism?
I don't think so. It's not the way I would see the way the term is usually used. The neoconservatives love to use that word, the culture wars. We've got important books out on it. It's often characterized, at least in the circles that I move in, as a sort of a war between the culture of life and the culture of death. It's seen as that we have all these death-dealing forces in the culture, things like racism and sexism and lack of respect for life and 1.2 million abortions and all of that. And it's seen that there's a great fight. I mean, there's some of the candidates, Gary Bowers will talk about this, in terms of a culture war. Alan Keyes talks about that the same way. And the other side of that issue are all what they think of as the life-giving forces. So I don't see it as between the two individualisms. I think they would see that two individualisms are part of the enemy. They're just two different ways of expressing this common problem of not caring to enhance the community of the human family to help it to grow. I think some people are, in some circles, people are worried about that culture wars as being too sharp a way of thinking about it, of what's going on, that it reduces the possibility of collaboration on trying to get things done. So I think that's the other way that debate is viewed. Let's not talk about the language of fight so much, or war. Let's find a language of dialogue, of getting along. Now you find both languages, of course, in the Scriptures. I'm going to come down on the side myself of looking for the more collaborative measures of how we're going to try to move this thing forward. So I think that's sort of the ideological sense that people come at that phrase with.
Yeah, but it's very hard for me to see, despite your little disclaimer there, the positive role of institutions, despite many limitations. We'll say economics is positive and motivation are positive. The international debts and the whole economic system, which is geared around greed and profit.
Oh.
I mean, it's hard to see.
Any redeeming value, Bernie? Is that hard to find any redeeming value? Yeah, I'm sure you're going to get people on different sides of that question, and you could make the case a lot stronger as you're making it for the destructive side of it, I'm sure.
And you just said we're supposed to be training people for justice.
Yeah. Very important, legitimate point. You have to sort that out. I mean, is it possible to see that these institutions are fundamentally ambivalent? That's my own position. fundamentally ambivalent, that means they cut both ways. They're constructive and destructive, and what outweighs what? You know, I mean, our educational system, I mean, you know, if you take that institution, I mean, we're failing in so many ways, and we haven't figured out how to do something about the inner city schools. I myself thought, I just wrote Michael Jordan a letter, and through a friend of his and so on, and said, I thought one of the most important things that happened in the recent past was when Michael Jordan went to Washington, D.C., and he talked to some middle school kids, told them that the way out is study, education. And he gave, I don't know, what was it, $4 million to get more creative efforts to teach students in the inner city. How you get teachers to learn how to teach students in the inner city. He gave that money for finding creative efforts. Anyway, I thought it was one of the important things that happened. And I wrote him and told him, I says, I just hope you don't stop with that. One initiative in Washington, I was suggesting a tour around the country, go to all major cities and repeat the same talk. And because, to me, the problem is one of motivation, how we get these students in there to think that it's okay to study. So they don't have to turn in their homework surreptitiously, which happens. Turn it in surreptitiously so no one else knows they actually did homework, because they're going to be looked down for them. But anyway, I see Michael as being someone that could speak to that. And that's educational system. But yeah, I mean, I think you picked on the weakest link of that. That's the multinationals, and you can go through all the the discrepancy in the salaries and the stuff that was on in the corporate world, and the downsizing and the firing of people that walk in and are out. I mean, heavens. I once said to Michael Novak, if you just once, Michael, wrote one critical word about the corporate world, you would become a more credible person. You know, and I mean, you read that stuff and you really see nothing but praise for the corporate world. Well, my own sense is there's something positive in that. If you believe that grace is operative in the world, there's no reason why grace can't percolate up in any system, any institution, in the midst of a lot of other negativity. My instinct is to go with the theological side of this thing. This is a third of the 4 sections that I want to talk about, and probably the most important one to me, because I'm convinced that theology is practical if it's done well. It's not some arcane science that people are doing in ivory towers, but it has meaning for us on the firing lines, and what the great theologians do help us. And we are the beneficiaries of one of the greatest centuries of theological ferment since the 13th century. I think you'd say that without fear of contradiction. Since the 13th century, when Bonaventure and Aquinas walked the earth at the same time and taught at the University of Paris, I don't think we've seen anything like the 20th century, where we've had at least 4 or 5 people that I think of as giants, and everyone else would as well, I suppose. Karl Barth, great neo-Orthodox theologian, probably the most influential theologian of the century, and Paul Tillich, his great work, great Lutheran theologian. Our Catholic world, we had that obscure Jesuit on the wall, Karl Rahner, and also Hans Urs von Balthasar and Bernard Lonergan. So we're the beneficiaries of giants. They wrote great stuff. And what they wrote is helpful to us and spins off with other lesser figures and so on. So that's part of my conviction here. So what I've tried to do is to take major theological categories and talk about them in terms of this quest for community and how we build up our local congregations into better communities. In fact, you could use it as an umbrella term. I'm trying to develop a communion theology here. A communal theology, communion theology in the major areas. So the first one is a theological anthropology, where we really have to cut through the privatism and individualism that has been so rampant ever since the time of Descartes. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It's very much of an individualistic thing. I can never say Descartes lately without remembering the story of how Descartes went into a bar and you heard this, Paul. Went into a bar and he says, The bartender looks at him and he says, do you want a beer? And Descartes answers, I think not, and promptly disappeared. I don't know why that strikes me so funny. A philosophical joke. Maybe that's what intrigues me about it. Promptly disappeared. Anyway, ever since Descartes and I think, therefore I am, it's so individualistic and so much starting with the individual person. Even someone modern like Heidegger, who's trying to get out of it, still ends up starting with the question, we humans are the people who question. We question, we want to know what it's all about. So we need an anthropology, an understanding of ourselves that is broader based. I think it's the Tonga people, isn't it, Bernie, that have another saying, not I cogito ergo sum, but I am because we are. Did I get that right? Yeah, the Tonga, an African sense of I am because we are. There's a polar opposite to Descartes. It links one's individual existence in the larger community. I am because we are. I have meaning only in terms of the larger community. So we begin to work out an anthropology that sounds very different. We're made in the image of God, and we're brothers and sisters and members of the one family. We are essentially social creatures. We know who we are because we get feedback. I always go back to my experience when I was studying in Oxford and doing nothing but studying, no ministerial work and so on. And I contrasted that with being in Sandusky, Ohio, in a parish earlier, where I walk down the street and someone says, Father, will I see you at the game tonight? Father, can I go to, I just want to talk to you about something. There was constant feedback about who I was. I was so clear to me my identity was social. And it became clear when I'm in Oxford and I'm doing no ministerial work, I'm doing nothing but sitting in a basement apartment and in a library trying to write something, doing nothing, no feedback, and I began to forget who I was. And I don't know if other people ever had that experience, have no cultural support, so very little reminder of who one is. You got to get pretty isolated to have that experience. But it became even clearer to me our identity is social. We know who we are because people tell us who we are, because people feed back to us who we are. We have constant things like, yeah, Peg?
It just occurs to me that that's part of the problem with Doris and Fred's marriage. Because Doris, I would guess, particularly had her identity shaped by who she was in relationship to the parents of her children.
Yes.
They were growing up, all those PTO friendships.
Yes.
Which then melted away. That community melted away as her children grew, and she's dealing with much more personal isolation, even though she may have her work and her other women's group.
Well said. And the other part of the problem is that Fred's got his own sense of who he is in that. And as I phrase it, they're trying to be a duo now. They got to figure out how to, out of all that history, how to interact as two people. And they're going to have to find support to do that. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. There's identity questions are tied up with this whole analysis for sure. And what I'm trying to say here is that our identity is social. We are interdependent people. And the community is not our adversary. It's our habitat. It's our environment. The community is where we flourish. It's a community that affirms us and supports us and challenges us. Good community, the kind we were describing. This is where we come to our better self. So that instead of using the language of the individual vis-a-vis the community, and this is so inbred in our American culture. I mean, it's you hear the language all the time. The abortion debate gets framed that way, is a matter of personal choice. And that side of the debate does not want to hear anything about communal setting, about larger questions. And both sides have their trouble in trying to figure out how to talk about all of this, but it's ingrained in our American being to think of ourselves as this sort of a rugged individualism kind of thing. Now, what we've got to do is to play out this other way of thinking. Martin Buber becomes, the great touchstone, Jewish philosopher, 20th century, of the interpersonal, I, thou, he talks about. He has a saying that individualism is a footbridge. It's not a final resting place. In other words, he's trying to tell us that this process of individuation that Doris is going through, she's got a midlife individuation process going on, to figure out who she is in some new setting, as Peg pointed out. And in all of that, to come to one's sense of, as an individual, Buber said, that's not a resting place, that's not a final place to be, that's a footbridge. That's a way to walk into community. It's a bridge into something else where we have an interdependent life. So she's got to figure out how to relate to Fred now in some new way, and to the larger community and to the parish. So this is this other sense of how we come to maturity. So that I'm calling it a social anthropology, sense of interdependence. I am because we are. I know who I am because I get feedback on it. The community is what helps us to grow. So the challenge is that we're already in communities. I mean, it's silly to think, that you're sitting in a study someplace and you begin to think, who am I in relation to the rest of the world? We're already in communities. We're born into a family, born into a culture. And the problem is, how do you relate to all of those ongoing social institutions? Okay, that's the social anthropology part here. Next is the doctrine of God. Now here, my conviction is that our doctrine of God, it really does have great influence on our self-perception, on who we are as individuals. Ronner says that if you told me enough about your image of yourself, of your image of God, you told me, who is God for you? Describe it carefully. I know an awful lot about what you think about yourself. I know an awful lot about your self-image. So it's obvious to us in some cases we deal with people who have a very heavy moralistic notion of God. God is an ogre. God is is a Jonathan Edwards kind of God, holding us over the fire and possibly cutting the string sort of thing. And when people have that image of God, we find very often self-image problems, lack of self-confidence, etc. So it's a pretty common experience for us pastoral ministers to see that connection. Now, when God is perceived, as it was in the tradition often, as this sort of self-subsistent being, and in the deistic tradition, very aloof from the world, the watchmaker who started it all up and so on, and sort of lets it go, or this circle of unchanging perfection, then it creates a sense that, what human beings should be all about is to be self-reliant. Emerson, you're to be a self-reliant kind of person. That's the model. In other words, Fred, in his managerial role, is really modeling something of what God is like. This is the good life. On the other hand, the image of God has been used when we have what we sometimes call the monarchy of the Father. We have an idea that notion of God justifies all the patriarchal systems, all the systems of domination. And we knew that with slavery. People said that. Just like we're sort of dependent upon God, thus the slaves or lesser beings have to be dependent upon some master. So all of the structures of domination in history have been able to be used, find a justification in the image of God and the way we perceive the deity. Now, what we've got in our own time, I think, is a wonderful recovery of a Trinitarian theology, which is a recovery of the mode of Eastern theology, and I think it's helpful to us in the sense of community. Yves Congar said that what we in the West got to do is learn how to breathe out of both lungs. In other words, the Eastern Church should not be just absent to us. I remember how sharp that criticism. I was in giving some talks in Moscow, and I remember going out to the monastery of Zagorsk with a young woman who was just a convert to Orthodoxy and to Russian Orthodoxy. And she knew I was a Catholic priest. And she says, I got a question for you. I says, what's that? She says, why are your Catholic churches so bare? I grew up in a culture hearing from Protestants, why are your churches so cluttered? That's to breathe out of two lungs. Hear it from another side. Why are your Catholic churches so bare? She hadn't been in any Quaker meeting halls, I guess. So, out of the Eastern world, which had much more of a sense of the Trinitarian notion of God, how we relate not just as Augustine. See, Augustine so often has been, I think, one-sided in at least his interpretation, but Augustine talked about the Trinity doing everything. He even raised questions about could any person of the Blessed Trinity have become man. In the Eastern world, that's sort of an unthinkable question because there's such a sense of the specific roles of the three persons in God. Rahner said that the economic Trinity is the immanent Trinity. What he meant by that was a challenge to Augustine. We cannot peer into the essence of God. None of us can see into God. We theologians cannot sit around and say, well, here's how it is in God, in the Godhead. Let me tell you what's going on there. No, there's a hubris about that. And Rahner says, you can't do that. All we know is the economic Trinity, not the immanent Trinity, not God in the God self. We know the economic Trinity. We know how we relate to God. We know how God touches us. And we in the Christian tradition like to think, well, we're creatures. We know we're creatures, and we call the one God Father that way, or maybe Mother that way, or Parent. And we Christians walk around say the one God has appeared in history. We call the one God in history the Word made flesh. And we sense divinization, we sense gift. And we say the one God who divinizes us we name Spirit. So that's what it means to say the economic Trinity is the basis of the immanent Trinity. Then what we say is that threefoldness, that way of relating to the one God tells us something about how the immanent Trinity says something about our doctrine of God, three persons in one God. All of that has to, I always think of Aquinas. Remember, it was on St. Nicholas Day in 1273, December 6th. Aquinas was on the third part of the Summa. It was on the section on the Sacrament of Penance. He put down his pen and never wrote again. Said to his secretary, why have you stopped writing? Says to his secretary, because everything I've written till now seems like straw, like nothing. Nothing. One of his theses earlier was the most important thing we can know about God is that we don't know God. And all the great theologians have retained that sort of modesty. Rahner says that God is the incomprehensible one. There's a thesis in Aquinas that says that even in the beatific vision, God remains incomprehensible. I remember Rahner came to the University of Chicago. I don't know if anyone else was there. Septicentennial of Aquinas' death, 1974. You missed it. Rahner got up in the great chapel there and started to read his talk in German. It was on the thesis in Aquinas that in the beatific vision God remains incomprehensible. Read the first paragraph in German, sat down in his chair. His translator got up and read the rest of it. Rahner took out a rosary, began to say his rosary, and fell asleep. I always say he's one of the few people I ever saw who fell asleep during his own talk. But that was the thesis on Aquinas. Even in the beatific vision, God remains incomprehensible. In other words, still, I like the word inexhaustible. It sets up the possibility of growth in heaven. You know, not sitting in a rocking chair for eternity, but growth. some other kind of image. Anyway, all that's by way of reminding us that the great theologians have said God is ultimately mystery for us. Can't peer into the Trinity, but we get clues, intimation. St. Bonaventure was good at that. He said all over the world, in creation, there are vestiges of the Trinity. Little clues to the great triune God. And the trick was to keep your eyes open to see the clues. God working. Well, this, what I see, there's a book written by woman theologian Catherine LaCugna on the Trinity titled God for Us. God for Us. And where she describes this economic Trinity as our sense of being overflowed with God's love. A God who's mad and improbable in His love for us. The hound of heaven who seeks us out. The one who's shown all the love and mercy by sending Christ into our midst. Who sends the Spirit to do amazing, remarkable things. All of that sort of thing. God is in communion with us. So this communion theology I'm trying to develop. It's a communion notion of the Trinity. God is in communion with us, divinizes us, changes us. I always get St. Basil. In one of his pericopes writes, his last line is, and we become God. Eastern thought. That's breathing out of two lungs dangerously, I suppose. Oh, this is breathing out of two lungs can get pretty scary. We become God, he says. We're divinized to such an extent the Eastern Fathers had that sense of the Holy Spirit changing us, coming into us and transforming us, divinizing us. Interesting to think about that sort of thing. So here's a God who sets up the notion that existence is therefore relational, that we're in interaction with God. So if a subsistent God, Supreme Being, all perfect, sort of uninvolved in a way, sets up a notion of self-reliance, the Trinitarian God, the God of communion, the God of overflowing love, sets up a sense that human existence at its best is communal. That's what it says, that's the reality. Whitehead likes this. Process theology, Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, Process and Reality, Hartshorne, all those people, John Cobb, I don't know if people are into that or not. All the process theologians say, that's getting it right. The human life is essentially organic. We are essentially interrelated. All of the cosmos, everything is connected in. And this Trinitarian doctrine speaks to that, reminds us of that, buttresses it, grounds it. God is a communion of love, then it's not surprising that every creature in the world is interrelated. We're all touched somehow or another. There's flow of energy that is strange and mysterious. What about all this stuff on healing these days? All the new material comes out of the medical profession largely. I happen to run into that guy Koenig from Duke University, done those studies on healing. These are people who are not necessarily believers or whatever, talking about how healings occur. I mean, it's blowing their mind. And, for us, out of a Christian sense, especially this organic sense, interconnected, we're all connected. Not too surprising that energy can flow from prayers to patience. Not too surprising. Well, that's all a way of trying to get at the Trinitarian doctrine here, of reestablishing God for us. God, a communion of love. God interacting with us.
What do you think of Christians in the early centuries did when there was no notion of the triune God? They had not invented it yet. Yeah,
well, they didn't have any problems, did they? They said, the comment is made before we ended up with Trinitarian doctrine in the 4th century. What did Christians do? Well, I think, as Catherine LaCugna says in her book, every Christian up until Nicaea was a subordinationist. That is, every Christian had this notion, identified God with the Father, and was talking about two emanations. The sending of Jesus as the Word made flesh and the sending of the Spirit. They had a Trinitarian outlook without worrying about the ontology of it. That's one way of thinking what Arius did. I mean, Arius was simply part of the culture in which there was a taken for granted subordinationism. The Father sent the Son. Jesus prayed to the Father. Jesus was obedient to the Father, all of which suggests a subordination. Oh, and then what Arius wanted to do was play that back into the immanent Trinity and say ontologically the Word is inferior then to the Father. That created part of our problems. But the early Christians, I think they were very at ease with this. They saw these emanations.
Going all the way back to Jesus' time, he did not have a triune God to worship.
Pardon me?
Jesus himself did not have a triune God.
Well, no. Jesus talked about Abba, and Jesus talked about sending the Paraclete. Right? John's Gospel, wonderful stuff. I will send the Paraclete. It will teach you everything. Will guide and instruct you. The Paraclete will live within you. So he addressed Abba and sent the Paraclete. Well, that's what becomes the basis of our Trinitarian doctrine. Nicaea had to react against Arius and set the one nature idea. So I mean, we've sort of struggled to keep a hold of this thing, I think, since. What is the common saying in the Trinity? There's 4 relations, 3 persons, 2 emanations or sendings, 1 God, and no proof. Another theological joke. I mean, like these. Let's take a break. Will you settle for 10 minutes?
Yeah.
10 minutes and return to do the Christology?
Oh, yeah. When I stop.